Well, this week we are beginning the study of the individual religions. We've just completed looking at introductory material related to what religion is, how people explain it, and things like that. And we looked at the global nature of religion that's present everywhere and that the world is just generally religious. And then we looked at worldview and how religion and worldview correlate, and that religions are generally worldviews, but not all worldviews are religious. And so now this brings us to individual religions, and we're going to start with the oldest monotheistic religion, that being Judaism. And so we'll be looking at Judaism, a religion of obedience and of the righteous God. And so I'll move over to the PowerPoints and we'll get started on that. Let me share the screen here. All right. Well, you can see some of the symbols here of Judaism: Star of David, Ten Commandments here, and the word in Hebrew for life and the word for Torah. And it just is to help us reference some of the important things that we'll be covering in this video. Let's get this thing going. One of the iconic places in Jerusalem is the Western Wall, often called just the Wall, or you'll hear it called the Wailing Wall, which is not what's the preferred title of it, but sometimes you hear people talking about it like that. It has to do with sometimes people's how they're speaking at the wall, but this is the upper part of the original retaining wall of the temple that Herod built. And so you can see how large that portion of the retaining wall is. So what is seen now at the Western Wall amounts to about the top third of the original wall. And people go to the wall, and you can see this in this picture here. You have the men's side and the women's side here. They don't mix at the wall, and they use it to go and pray at this wall and to put notes there about their prayers. So twice a year, it's kind of a tradition to go twice a year for put prayer notes there, and they're picked up. I think it is twice a year, and then they're buried on the Mount of Olives. So to see the foundations of the wall, you have to really take a tour in the tunnels underneath there to get a good view of that. But that's the part you do see out in the open. Maybe these pictures will be a little more helpful. Here's looking at the Western Wall from a distance, so you can see it there. And in the background is where the temple would have been built, but now there's a mosque on it. But this would have been all part of the original part of the temple. Here's one way of looking at it over here, this diagram of the temple, and here's the Western Wall pointing it out here, and that's the part you're seeing. And then you can get another view of it here as well, where this one shows, here's the diagram of the temple area, and you can see this is where the Western Wall is. So maybe that gives you an example, but it goes back to the first century, and Herod built the temple to replace the first temple. And so this still today for modern Jews is a sacred place. Modern Judaism is associated with Moses receiving the law in Mount Sinai. Biblically, we would say as Christians, it goes back to Abraham as the father of the nation of Israel. and out of his seed, out of his ancestors come uh, Abraham, there's Isaac, Jacob, and we see them are the ancestors to give rise to the time that the Israelites are in Egypt, because they went there to time of Joseph. Well, Jacob and his family, they're in the promised land, but they have a famine, and they end up getting food from Egypt. Eventually, Joseph moves them there, and so they have the land there in Egypt, which they raise their sheep and so forth. But so really, the starting point biblically is with Abraham, because it's the promise that God makes to Abraham that he'll have the promised land, the land of Canaan, which becomes Palestine, and that through his seed, all nations would be blessed. That's looking to the Messiah. And for those of us as Christians, Jesus being the Messiah. And so we would trace it back beyond just the Moses receiving the law, but that is a very important time period, and it sets a standard for the Jewish culture and theocracy that they had coming at that time. Well, the Shema, which is Judaism's basic statement of faith, is found in Deuteronomy 6, which begins with, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one." And so monotheism is considered the source of monotheism. But if you read in your Bible from Genesis to 1 through 11, you see God involved in the whole world as the one true God. So it goes further back than just with Judaism. They just become God's chosen people, as it says, but they're people that God uses to bring about the coming of the Messiah, many centuries later. And so that's a basic part of the story of the Bible, this narrative from the beginning of the world until the coming of Christ. And then New Testament, you have a discussion of what all that meant at that time period. All right, so we're going to just do a quick timeline look at Israel and get us up to the two commonwealths. There is a timeline associated with this presentation. Those of you who are taking it on Canvas can access that timeline. But chapters 1 through 11 of Genesis, we see God just involved with the world. He creates the world, he creates humanity in his own image, indicating that all humans are of equal value in God's sight. But he's involved, but humanity, he's always communicating to them, wanting them to be in a right relationship with him. But at the same time, humanity is rebellious and they don't want to do that, but they're still answerable to God. And so you have, God trying to assist humanity, even when they've sinned and rebelled against him, but he tries to bring them back by various means. And finally, there is a flood, but he saves the family to replenish the earth through Noah's family. But then when you get past chapter 11, you see if the Bible focuses on Abraham, and he becomes the father of a chosen people, or a people that God has chosen for a specific purpose, which is that through them would come the Messiah, and that they would receive the promised land that was currently occupied by other people. But as he says to Abraham, through your seed, our ancestors, all people will be blessed. And we can put Abraham around 2100 BC, contrary to what earlier scholars had thought, that this was Abraham didn't come from a civilized area, but on the contrary, later it was found that there was a great civilization there, and that they even had school books and library and things like that. So education was available. But the story follows Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as they are the fathers of the Israelite people. Then the Bible follows Joseph, which is not the through whom the Messiah will come, but he is the one who his brothers had tried to get rid of, but he ends up coming second in power at Egypt at an opportune time, which the Bible points out that God worked all this out. And so he saves his father and family, and they're able to come during a time of famine and live in Egypt and be protected there until eventually the government of Egypt changes. And they're looked at as a threat to the Egyptians because they are fairly populous compared to the Egyptians there. So they get oppressed and enslaved. But eventually, God brings them out of Egypt, and Moses leading the way. And that gives rise, of course, to the giving of the law that you see. And that's where a lot of people kind of begin the story of the nation of Israel. But as we can see, there was more to it behind it that was leading up to this particular time period. Generally, in modern Judaism, its history is divided into two commonwealths, and some people throw in a third one that we'll talk about a little bit later. But the two commonwealths, the first one begins with the law being given, and then the fall of the southern kingdom, which is approximately 586 BC. And so that was under the Babylonians. And then the second Commonwealth goes from 586 BC to 70 AD 70, which is with the destruction of the second temple built by Herod. So those are the two broad categories of the two commonwealths. As you imagine now, there's since AD 70 till now, there's a lot of other history dealing with Israel and Judaism, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. The first Commonwealth, going back to that, this just some of the things that occur during this time period. First of all, you get the Exodus from Egypt, which is a key event in Judaism's history. And it's often referred to in the Bible throughout, and just because it's that important of event, showing how God is keeping his promise to give the Israelites the promised land. So you have the Exodus and giving of the law. The traditional dates are 1446, 1406. So they migrate from Egypt here and then move up here. It takes them 40 years because of rebellion against God, but they do eventually take the promised land. And then you get a period of judges that become rulers and try to guide the people to what God wants them to do. But in the midst of all this, you have some rebellion and people not acting the way they should be, but God's always trying to bring them back to him. Then you have the time of the United Kingdom when the people of Israel want a king like the other nations. God warns them that it's not a very good idea, but he allows them to go forward with that. So you have this time period of Saul and David and Solomon, which is the United Kingdom. And then it's divided into the Northern Kingdom up here, what is generally who we call Israel. Then the Southern Kingdom down here, Judah. And so they're ruled by their separate kings until the fall of Northern Kingdom in 722 BC under the Assyrians. And then the Assyrians are conquered by the Babylonians, who then come down and they capture the southern part of what later becomes Palestine, and that being Judah in 586. So that's the main events that occurred during the first Commonwealth. So in this time period, you see some particular features. First of all, this is where you get the identity of the Israelite people as a nation. Before that, you had Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, but these would be the ancestors of what would later make up the nation of Israel. Other thing is the legal codes. We think of the Ten Commandments, but there were really 619 different laws that were given by God. So this legal code becomes the center of the beliefs. They have their belief in God, but they look at the legal code, and even to the point sometimes that the legal code takes precedence. And we see Jesus criticizing the fact that they become very legalistic, some of the Jewish leaders, and they kind of add to the code and things, and they don't really follow it the way it was intended to be followed. And then you had the worship and sacrificial system. There was a tabernacle, a temporary tabernacle built that was portable, that they could carry with them as they were migrating towards the promised land and wandered around the wilderness for a while. But later, David and then Solomon, David had the plan to build a temple, Solomon would build it, and they'd have a place of worship right there in Jerusalem. So you have this worship and sacrificial system being given in the legal codes, but and then a temporary one that they could fold up and carry with them until it was later established during the United Kingdom. During the Second Commonwealth, this is after the Northern Kingdom was conquered by the Syrians, Southern by the Babylonians. So you have the fall of the Southern Kingdom is the beginning of the Second Commonwealth, where the children of Israel go into captivity under the Babylonians, Babylonian dynasty falls to the Persian dynasty. And during this time, you have prophets, and even before this time, you had prophets, but you see the last prophet, Malachi, in 440 BC. And then this moves into the intertestamental period where the Bible, the Old Testament ends, and then it'll pick up with the New Testament, talking about the coming Messiah in the first century. So there's going to be 300 or so years there that 300 to 400 years where there's silence of scripture, but we do have historical data from that time period. You have the conquest of Alexander the Great would be one of the major things that occurred during this time period. And he conquered a lot of the world at that time. And and that would have a great influence on the first century because the Greek influence among the Roman Empire would become very important. Excuse me. You have the Maccabean revolt in 166 BC, where the Israelites rebel against the oppression of what was left of the Alexander's empire, but at that time it had been broken up and under different generals. Judah was primarily under Ptolemy's generals' territory. But as time would move forward, you move into the New Testament time, you have Herod the Great, who was from the Hasmonean kingdom. He worked with the Romans and was, the king under Rome's power to rule over the Palestine at that time. And the Second Commonwealth will end in AD 70, this would be with the destruction of Jerusalem. You know, if you looked in the New Testament, you know that, you know, Jesus prophesied that Israel would be, Jerusalem would be destroyed, and that was the case. Jesus uh, would die on the cross around AD uh, 30 to 33, right in there. But some 40 years later, the destruction of Jerusalem would occur. The Jews would fight on, even with the destruction of Jerusalem, and their last stand was at Masada in AD 74, which is a really high hill on which it was, you know, really hard for the enemy to get up there, and we'll see a little picture of that in a little bit. But they made their last stand there until the Romans destroyed that holdout. So features of the Second Commonwealth was the development of an ethnic identity. They saw themselves as an ethnic group, and you see this, you know, going into the New Testament, that they were a particular ethnic identity there that separated them from the Roman culture around them. They still held on to the legal code. Keeping the law was important, and we see in the New Testament where it becomes almost legalistic. And not only was it the written law, but there was an oral law that was added to it all. There was devotion to God. They still held to the one God, but there were a lot of party divisions, and you have particularly the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians. You could throw in the Essenes, but they had different views of things. The Herodians were mainly Jews, but they supported the Herod's dynasty as a ruler, and so they were more a political party than a religious party. On the other hand, Pharisees and Sadducees were involved in politics, but they were more in line with the different theological differences. Pharisees wanted to keep the law, including the oral traditions, and they believed in the afterlife and angels and the resurrection of the dead, where the Sadducees, on the other hand, did not believe that, but yet they were rulers and they controlled the temple precincts. And so a lot of party division there, and that shows up in the writings of the New Testament. As the writers wrote about it, they wrote about these different parties there. But there was also a messianic expectation. They were still at this time thinking there was going to be a Messiah. And even when Jesus came during his time period, people were looking for a Messiah. And for a lot of people, Jesus was that Messiah. Of course, that's what the Bible is saying, New Testament was saying. He was the promised Messiah. Although you would have a lot of Jewish leaders who would, you know, say, no, he's not the Messiah. And to this day, you have Jews who would say, no, Jesus wasn't the Messiah. But you do have Messianic Jews today who do recognize that Jesus is the Messiah. But we'll get into more of that as we get into the different teachings in modern day Judaism. They currently have a lot of different divisions as well that impact how they look at their own history and their own relationship with God. So that's the Second Commonwealth. Here is a picture. This one here is a model of what the temple looked like, Herod's temple looked like. It was quite a structure. Took 40 years to build. But it was very beautiful and dominated the landscape of Jerusalem. Over here is Masada. You can see this very steep hill, and it's my wife and I visited this some years back. It's very hot there, and it's quite a hike up to that. They do have a tram that take you up to the top. But you can't see it in this picture, but and the Romans took years to build a dirt ramp up this other side here. in which they eventually built it up so they could send their troops up there and break, defeat the Jews. And to this day, both of these places are sacred to the Jews. So where the temple was, which is not there now, is a sacred location, but also Masada is still very sacred. And I was told while I was there that the if you everybody's supposed to serve in the military a certain amount of time in Israel, and when you go through your boot camp and things training, the last place they take you is top of Masada, in which they again say, as a nation of Israel, and never again will they be defeated. And so they still use these as markers for their history and for how they view themselves today. All right. As things change for Israel, you have after the fall of Masada, and you have Jerusalem being destroyed and the temple being destroyed. The center really of Judaism had been Jerusalem, but this meant without the temple there where the sacrifice could be offered, they always had synagogues where they would go and listen to the law being read and their prayers and singing and stuff. But there was going to be a change now as Israel moves from being centered around Jerusalem. And this is what's called Rabbinic Judaism. So it developed after the fall of Masada and primarily was carried on by the Pharisees as the source for the rabbis, in other words, the religious leaders would continue to carry it on, but more in a synagogue situation, not a temple situation. So the emphasis no longer was on sacrifices like animal sacrifices, but emphasis on obedience to the law. Today, Judaism emphasizes obedience to law, but not necessarily a personal belief or a relationship with God. It's more in terms of how do I make my life better, except there is more of the other in more orthodox Judaism. The rabbis kept the Tanakh, Jewish scriptures, and so during this time period they had their scrolls of the Old Testament, and you had the law, the prophets, and the writings, and they would keep those and they would copy them, and they had a whole incredibly complex copying system which kept any mistakes to a minimum. And but they would continue to keep those safe, and they would also be collecting writings about the law and the prophets and uh, writings. So this was collecting was called the Mishnah, and we will. This was begun during this time period. We will spend some time talking about the various writings that come out of following the law and so forth. And that is part of the modern Jewish religion today. So the sacrificial system then is replaced with liturgical prayer and ethical behavior. And to this day, one of the strongest things in modern Judaism is ethical behavior and making the world a better place. And you'll see this in some of the divisions of Judaism. Synagogues, as I mentioned earlier, they will become the centers of worship and not the temple. The minyan is a quorum of 10 male adults that are needed to have a community or to start up a synagogue there. And so wherever you could get 10 male adults together, you could set this up. And this was a common practice as Judaism spread out from Palestine as they lost their home country, and then they'd have to be immigrants in various other parts of the world. And we'll see some of that as we go along here. Rabbinic Judaism to the Middle Ages. This is a really fast overview of the history, but it's just to give us a context for modern Judaism. You had an AD 136 Bar Kokhba rebellion, but that was when the rebellion was put down, and at that point, Jerusalem is just razed to the ground, and this was the final straw that beyond the 80, 70, and so forth, it just totally dispersed Jews to various parts of the Roman Empire. It was during this time period to 70 AD to 200 AD that the Mishnah is completed by Rabbi Judah, the prince, he was called, about AD 200. It's legal teachings about the oral Torah law, and we'll get into the specifics of that later. The Jews are dispersed into the Persian Empire among the Zoroastrians, which we'll take a look at Zoroastrianism a little bit later on. It's a monotheistic religion, but different from Judaism. But Persia became the center of Jewish intellectual activity until about the 10th century. And but remember that before the 10th century, you have the rise of Islam in the 7th century. And so with the rise of Shiite Islam coming into Persia, Judaism began to move out of Persia, going north towards Europe and to the Iberian Peninsula, in other words, what we call Spain today and Portugal. And so you get to see Jews are moving further north and in some cases west into the area of Turkey. But eventually they're going to be driven out of Turkey as well and move mainly into Europe area. So further movement to Europe because of the anti-Semitism of Islam and even Christianity during the Crusades. Christianity at that time, its leadership began to look at the Jews as an enemy, as they looked at Islam as an enemy. And so the Crusades are not one of the finer moments of Christianity. But in either case, the Jews were being persecuted by Muslims and Christians, and so it was a difficult time for the Jews. All right, so this is a kind of a map here of how this happened. Here in Palestine, by AD 200, you have Jews moving into Asia Minor, or what will become known as Turkey, then on into Europe here and over to the Iberian Peninsula. You have during the Middle Ages, you have what's called the Talmudic tradition to the Middle Ages. And during this time period, you have the Crusades, began in the 11th century. There were a lot of Jews that fell victim to this fanatic idea of having get Jerusalem back, which they managed to accomplish it one time. But for the most part, the Crusades were just a waste of lives and, just political things going on that really had really no good Christian reason for doing. But the Jews in that time period were pressured with force to convert. And so you see there's a history of Jews being persecuted. But as Judaism has history goes by and Judaism is continuing to find itself in its various places that it's had to migrate to. You have some standout individuals who kind of become the center of Jewish thinking. Rashi is one of those, Rabbi Solomon ben Isaac, 1040 to 1105. He believed in the literal interpretation of scripture. Rambam, as his nickname is, Rabbi Moses Maimonides, 1135 to 1204, known as an intellectual in defending Judaism. He even wrote a commentary on the Mishnah. These are a lot of the writings of the Jews. He's even quoted by one of the great theologians of Christianity, Thomas Aquinas. So he is one of those that keeps Jewish thinking alive and trying to say, okay, what is Judaism in the midst of where we're at historically now? All right, and so by 1492, we kind of know this is a time period for when Columbus was sent out by Spain. He's going to discover the New World. But it's during this same time period that there's in Judaism and then their thinking that, and it was even predicted by the Kabbalic scholars that this would be a year of redemption, looking toward the time of the Messiah coming. And now we'll talk about Kabbalic scholars, we'll talk about that movement later on, but it's just one of the groups within Judaism that was, still goes on today, but was important at that time period. But they kept saying there's going to be this redemptive year. But it didn't turn out that way, of course. No Messiah came. Ferdinand and Isabella unified Spain under Catholic rule instead and expelled the Jews. So it really wasn't turning out to be a saving time period for Jews. But this pushed the Jews further into Europe, southeastern Europe, and under Turkish rule. They were able to live for a while peacefully in that environment. Others moved further north into what we call Western Europe today. During this time period, because of the push under Catholicism, some Jews did convert rather than be expelled. This is time period the Inquisition used to oftentimes inappropriately, violently enforce proper Catholic doctrine, and not a proud period for Christianity as a whole. After 1555, Italy and Germany forced Jews into what are called ghettos, and they had to wear yellow armbands to distinguish them from other non-Jews. Now, you might recognize that this was used later by the Nazis in the 20th century, 1930s through to World War II, to designate the Jews as inferior people. And of course, they would be targeted for genocide by Nazi Germany. But realize that practice was already being done even before the time of Germany. Just Germany took it to its logical conclusion. If they're not real human beings, then they don't have the right to live if we don't want them to. But this time period is all moving to the modern time, when it's with the 19th and 20th century, when a lot of Jews will be killed. So the forced migration gave rise to two main Jewish groups. There's subgroups, but basically you have the Sephardic Jews that have Spanish roots, having first settled in Spain. in Turkey area. You have it down here in the picture here, right here. And so they developed a language called Ladino, a Spanish dialect with Hebrew script. More popularly known as the Ashkenazic Jews who settled in northeastern Europe. This is that blue area here, and they were separate from the Gentile Europeans. They had their own communities oftentimes, and their language was Yiddish. And a lot of the those who migrated onto the U.S., you have a large population of Jews from that area, and they spoke Yiddish. So it's German with a Hebrew script. You have other independent groups, as it's pointing out here, and the Mizrahi here, but some of these up in North Africa. You can find this map at this website, but it gives you some other information. So this brings us on into the 17th century, where you have these groups. You have Jews as a whole, as a ethnic identity, but religiously, they're trying to discover what they are religiously and what that's made up of. And so you get different groups developing during this time period, and certain leaders who move uh, Jewish thinking in one direction or another. One of those is Sabbatai Levi. The Jews from Europe, Middle East, North Africa thought him to be the Messiah. So here's one that they focus on, as could this person be, the Messiah? So they're still looking for the Messiah, at least some of them. But he actually publicly proclaimed that Nathan of Gaza was the Messiah. But to prove, his leadership, he decided that he would go to Turkey and convert the Turkish Sultan. But when he got there, the Turkish Sultan used his power, said, you either convert to Islam or be killed. He converted to being a Muslim, which of course killed any idea that he could be the Messiah. And this kind of brought in a general despair among Jews of the messianic hope ever coming about and not happening. And to this very day, there are various groups of Jews that they're not looking for a Messiah anymore at all. But we'll look at those specific groups and their view of that as we move along here. One of the earliest new movements that came with the reinterpretation of Judaism now and going into the modern period, 18th century, 19th, 20th century type of thing, is the Hasidism. And it comes from the word Hasid, which means pious one. And this was a movement in among the Eastern European Jews. And it was very communal in nature. They would develop communities organized around the Zadok, which is a term for righteous man. And the Zadok wasn't just a preacher in the sense that, he read the, scriptures and tell people about it, but he actually had a direct link between God and humans. So he had a link to God, and he would give that information to other people. And eventually out of this would give rise to what is called Kabbalism. This is a very mystical form of Judaism where through various activities, dancing and things like that, that you could actually have a direct connection with God in your life. So it's a very mystical type of thing. But for the Hasidism, the central figure became Israel bin Eliezer. He was known as Baal Shem, Master Baal meaning master of the good name, or it could mean good master of the name. And so Shem becomes, the leader uh, during this time. He was also known as Besht, and he was born in the 1700s, and it was said he was a miracle worker in Eastern Europe. Well, Hasidism, as it developed, uh, it was God was seen to be found not in studying or obeying the law, but found inside the person and found it manifested in singing and dancing. Now, Kabbalism would take it even further, but this gives you the direction that gave rise to Kabbalism. It wasn't so much you study the law, obey it, but there was a connection with God that manifests itself with this singing and dancing. So it was a joyful expression of God in their midst. Some would say, well, they didn't want to follow the law. That's not true. They weren't antinomians. They did believe in obeying God, but that was not the center of what they were about. But the Kabbalism, but was they did follow not Kabbalism but Hasidism. Uh, they did follow Talmudic tradition, but it was more of a mystical thing. Now, note here I mentioned that Talmud is the comprehensive written versions of the Jewish oral law and subsequent commentaries on it, which originated in the 2nd century that we mentioned earlier. The Mishnah, which means repeated study, is the original written version of the oral law, and the Gemara, completion, is the record of rabbinic discussion following this writing down of that information. And we'll get into more specifics on that as we go along. But access to God could be found through devotion and prayer, primarily, is the center of that. So this very joyful celebration is part of devotion and prayer, all puts you into, following God in the way they were looking at it at that time. After Bish's death, the village set up centered around what was called a Rebbe or a Zedek, who was believed to have healing powers. So they were higher than preachers as we think of them today, or pastors of a church, but you know, but the Rebbe, from their perspective, the Rebbe was given absolute obedience, so his word was final. But they would be persecuted in their home countries, and would drive a lot of them out of their country, especially as the rise of Nazism came. A lot of them would immigrate to the U.S., and so it's during the 20th century, 1930s on through World War II, that Nazi Germany, with their view of the Aryan race being supreme, and not and looking at the Jews as subhuman, that they tried to exterminate the Jews and did kill over 6 million in the concentration camps, and there was another 3 million of other people. But in the midst of all of this, there was a view that maybe they would have their own homeland again in Palestine. But the Jews themselves couldn't agree if this was a good thing, because there wasn't a Messiah. It was always kind of tied. You get your homeland back when the Messiah comes, but some weren't so sure a Messiah was coming. And can there be a state of Israel without a Messiah? But a number of them decided, well, even if there's a Messiah, we could still have our home. But there was disagreement among Jews as to whether to really work towards having their own homeland again in Palestine. And we'll see a little bit of that as we go along here. Hasidism currently retains those cultural forms of the 18th century, sort of like the Amish, who still wear clothes from the earlier time period. You'll see them with that kind of dark clothing, and it's generally black clothing. You will see the men will have beards and braids, and so if you go back to the Middle Ages, non-people or those not born of high rank could not wear colorful clothes, like, so they had to wear the black or brown clothes, uh, and even back then you had this yellow armband. Now currently Hasidism has only about 650,000 believers worldwide. And just in general, their belief is kind of pantheistic, as the world is in general part of God's being. And so they believe in what they call divakut, which is an interconnectedness between God and humanity, as with the rest of the world. So that's kind of a background to Hasidism. Now we're going to move into another form of Judaism called Reformed Judaism. And this arose during the 18th century as well. But it had a whole different tenor. The other one was around celebration with God and prayer and dancing, and it wasn't an intellectual type of thing. Where this Reform Judaism would come from the intellectual side of things. It accepted European culture and intellectual climate. So they weren't going to keep those clothes that you see as Hasidism. The central figure here was Moses Mendelssohn, 1729, 1786, studied at the University of Berlin. He abandoned outward Jewish forms. In other words, he was wanting to bring Judaism into the modern age and just allow them to accept the cultural norms of the time and forms. Not that they had to give up their belief in God, but he did adopt the Enlightenment ideal of universality of humanity. So Jews were free to adopt culture in which they lived. And you will find during this time period that you find Jews who didn't believe, in God, and didn't really practice any of the traditional forms of Judaism's. So followers felt like traditional Jews practices were hindering Jews from integrating into modern life. And so you have things, you got Freud, for example, that, he's an example of, a Jew who buys into this kind of thinking, and he himself, just thought of God as, people needed a father figure, or they just were too immature, so they have to have God as something they depend on. So this is a whole different way of thinking. So this is a whole nother form Judaism at this time period. Some main characteristics of Reformed Judaism. Traditional forms are not authoritative, so any of the forms that have traditionally been passed down, they're not authoritative. You can do them, but there's no authority that you have to do them. There's no law that you have to do them. The Talmud, their writings are not considered authoritative at all. Following Orthodox practices are not wrong, but they're certainly not binding. They would look at religious practice in a state of in a state that just continues to develop. it doesn't stay static. It's, always developing as society changes, cultures change. They don't see an unchanging eternal truth in the midst of it all. It just depends on the time period. They don't seek a Messiah. If Messiah exists, it's people working to make a better world. God acting in history towards messianic freedom. The idea for them is that, we make our own way in this world. And if we do it, work hard, do things right, act ethically, the messianic freedom comes from the results of that. They were initially opposed to a separate homeland for Jews, but in the wake of the Holocaust, they changed their position on that, and they actually supported a state of Israel, thinking about it as they could have their own homeland and protect themselves from further genocide like that. They do have meeting places, and they often call them a temple. Today, you can go to various different forms of Judaism, and some of them will call their place a synagogue. Others will call themselves a temple. For Reformed, you often hear them call their meeting place a temple. But their view and how they worship is similar concerns as mainline Protestants in worship. Um, they're more concerned with social justice and things like that. And so in that regard, they're quite different from Orthodox Judaism. But you do find a lot of Reformed Jewish temples around, and when you see that, you can guess that this is probably the direction they go. All right, we're going to talk now about Orthodox Judaism. This is the more traditional Judaism that we tend to think of when we think of Judaism, modern Judaism today. It also rose in the 18th on into the 19th century. And really, it was in opposition to what was happening with Reform Judaism, which was pushing away the ethnic identity more and conforming to the general world around them. And so they were reacting against this. And they consider themselves to be the true Judaism that is really going back to Judaism as it really was intended. You have several figures here that are leaders in Orthodox Judaism. Moses Sofer is one, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, another, Rabbi Yisrael Lipkin Salanter is another. So when we talk about Orthodox Judaism, they can be either Zionists or non-Zionists. By that, a Zionist is someone that believes in Palestine being their homeland, and that salvation is linked to retaking the Holy Land. And it also is linked with the Messianic expectation. But there are many sects of Zionism, so you just, if you talk to somebody about it, you have to find out generally what sect they're a part of. Zionist movement is connected with Theodor Herzl. He was a journalist, believed the Jews could not defend themselves against anti-Semitism without a nation. And this has been the general tenor that a lot of the Jews have said, that the best way to protect themselves against anti-Semitism and being persecuted, or even being, again, having genocide practiced against them, is to have their own nation so they can protect themselves. But it's also connected with the idea of a Messiah as well, especially in Orthodox Judaism. So some of the main characteristics with Orthodox Judaism: God revealed himself only an eternal, unchanging covenant given at Sinai. This is quite different from Reform Judaism. Notice it's only an eternal, unchanging covenant. Reform would say everything's changing. They believe in literal messianic belief. In other words, there is going to be a literal Messiah. They believe in keeping the written and oral Torah. So what we call the Old Testament, and then the oral traditions associated with it that were accumulated over years. They also believe it is necessary to return to Jerusalem and wait for the deliverance of the Messiah. And so they have a strict adherence to traditional Jewish law. So you would see them practicing kosher, that they don't eat certain foods, and they have to kosher their kitchens at certain times, and so on, among other traditions. There is some acceptance of modern culture, but it can vary depending on the group of Orthodox Jews. Some of them just outright reject modern culture. And so it just various levels of it is seen in Orthodox Judaism. Jewish religion is generally studied in the traditional style with no forms of modern scholarship. And it's not unusual to see them studying at the school, standing up, and they're memorizing scripture oftentimes. But they have a very, they are trying to understand what we call the Old Testament, and they study it quite carefully. But that is part of the fact that they believe it is something that should be followed strictly. All right. You have a couple of smaller groups that are also part of the various sects of Judaism. You got conservative Judaism, which arose in the 19th century. The central figure here was Zacharias Frankel in Germany. They too characterized by adhering to the law, but they were more open to adapting to contemporary culture. And so you may find a place where Reform Jews meet for religious services, but you can find a place where conservative Jews meet, but they're not to be confused with Orthodox Jews. Reconstructionist Judaism occurred in 1934, associated with the central figure Mordecai Kaplan. Now, this was a small movement, and they were attempting to integrate religious Judaism into all aspects of Jewish life with the evolution of a total Jewish culture. They didn't really look at themselves as a covenant people. The main goal was, as a Jewish life, was to pursue morality and justice. So this, and what you'll find among a lot of Jews that aren't in the Orthodox, morality and justice are very important parts of it, not necessarily waiting for a Messiah or anything like that. So you see this here again in the Reconstructionist Judaism. Well, this is where I'm going to mention the third commonwealth that some people propose. It's not officially seen as one of the commonwealths, but it is a specific time period after the Jews have migrated into Europe and Turkey area, but then later they're persecuted in Europe with the Nazis. You see a large migration to making their homeland in Palestine, which had been controlled by the Turkish government, but after World War One, the map was changed and it came under the oversight of Britain. And by World War II, Britain was in control of Palestine. And during this time period from the First World War on, Yeah, both Arabs and Jews migrating into the Palestinian area, which of course gives rise to the whole issue today of the problem between Palestinians and Jews. Uh, but because of the Holocaust and World War II, the international opinion was in favor of that Palestine becoming the homeland of the Jews, which of course didn't sit well with the Palestinians, who to this day don't accept the nation of Israel as having a right to exist. But in 1948, uh, the United Nations accepted the state of Israel, and since then it's existed, but it's still disputed by the Palestinians. And in 1967, you had Jerusalem had been split up and wasn't totally under control until 1967. Then the Israelis got total control of Jerusalem as well. And so this is kind of a brief run through of the development of Judaism from its ancient roots to modern day. So after this, the next one, we'll move into the writings and see some of the things that are connected with Judaism and in some way or another are connected to one form of Judaism or another. But we'll do that in the next one. And so I'm going to get out of this PowerPoint and hope that you will take a look at the next video as we continue our study of modern Judaism. Take care.